All right, so
this meeting is being recorded.
All right, so I'll just do a very quick talking point that we'll delve into the program right away. So hello and welcome to this edition of the Sankofa African Affairs webinar brought to you by Better Associate Consulting Limited in collaboration with Budget IT Ghana. My name is Benjamin Akwoye. It's August 23rd, 2024, 1 p.m. US Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Nigerian time, and 5 p.m. GMT in Ghana. Today's discussion topic, borrowing to finance infrastructure gap. Nigeria's effect on national security is actually a part 2 of a 2-part series of Sankofa scheduled discussions on economic development and debt situation in Nigeria. The discussion forms part of Sankofa African Affairs discussion series on U.S. strategic objectives on development towards sub-Saharan Africa and the African Union Agenda 2063. So I'm just going to give you part of what the U.S. development strategy towards Africa talks about. So part of the U.S. strategic objective on development towards sub-Saharan Africa, as announced by the Biden administration in August 2022, reads as follows: working with African countries to promote stronger growth trajectory and debt sustainability, including leveraging multilateral institutions, global partners, and international initiatives to support Africa's economic recovery. So this is in the aftermath of COVID-19. So let's go back to also to the AU. Part of the AU 2063 agenda on Africa's development aims at looking at strategies for Africa to finance her own development, most investments to fill the infrastructure gap. So given the Biden administration strategic objectives and the AU agenda, what we want to do today, we want to explore whether Nigeria has borrowed enough for its development needs, given its public debt portfolios and its debt management strategies. So to our listeners and viewers on the various social media platforms around the world, the Sankofa African webinars are anchored on a myriad of perspectives. So there may be differences of opinions from our guests based on their expertise, knowledge, and experiences. The difference in opinions do not necessarily mean perspectives and thoughts shared are wrong, but reflect a divergence of ideas to address economic, political, and security challenges facing the African continent. And also, sometimes we use narratives. The narratives help us for our panelists to present their own independent perspective from whoever they work for. They can choose to speak on record, or they can share their perspectives based on some of the discussions that I will delve into, right? So today we are honored to be joined by experts from academia, civil society, think tanks, corporate institutions, who have been helping us to delve into the various aspects of Nigeria's development needs and current debt situations in the wake of the economic hardships and bad governance protests. Joining us today, I don't think Miriam has joined us. Miriam, she has been on the program. She was here last week, right? She's a program manager, Center for Policy Research and Development Solutions in Abuja, Nigeria. We are being joined also by Ms. Umamia Omosimi. I hope I got that thing correct, right? Did I get your name right?
So it's actually Omomia Omosomi. So
okay, Omomia Omosomi, all right. She's a lead economist and researcher, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Nigeria. Then we have Mr. Akola Wole Odaloni, right? Did I get it right?
No, you didn't. My name is Akola Wole Odunlami.
Okay, Odunlami, all right. Yes. He's a senior manager, strategy, and also as PricewaterhouseCoopers, Nigeria. Then we have Dr. Jamilu Jafari, right? He's a prominent Nigerian social development strategist. Now, I just want to give a brief background because he has been in public service for a long time. So we want to take advantage of all the expertise, right, that he has accumulated over the years. So I'm trying to give a little bit profile, read a little bit profile about him so that he will be able to help us to proceed towards the program. He's a prominent Nigerian social development strategist with over 25 years of experience in governance and economic development. His career has various roles, including significant research and project experience with the Federal Housing Authority, the Nigerian National Assembly, and the Revenue Mobilization Allocation and Fiscal Commission. These roles have equipped him with the ability to mobilize resources and support policy implemented effectively. So in 2020, he joined the Nigerian Police Trust Fund as a Deputy Director of Training, Welfare, and Institution Development, where he coordinated the training of approximately 15,000 personnel between 2020 and 2024. He later served as a Special Assistant for the Public Affairs in the Office of the Minister for Transportation from September 2023 to May 2024. Subsequently, he was appointed Director General, Federal Government Relations and Abuja Liaison for the Gombe State Governor's Cabinet. Some of his areas of expertise are human capital development, project management and evaluation, development research and policy, public and policy analysis, private sector development, negotiating and lobbying, right? He's a member of the, and also a fellow of the Institute of Public Administration, and also a member of the Nigerian Institute of. So we have a very rich profile. So we'll be tapping into all your years of experience. So you are welcome for the first time to our program.
Prof, thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you. We're expecting to get Dr. Esther Adegbete, who's a Professor Emeritus of Finance, Department of Finance, Faculty of Management Sciences at UNILAG, right? But I think she sent me a message that she's had an emergency. So I think we can proceed. Once she joins us, then I will try to introduce her. So let me take this opportunity to welcome all of you for the first time to the Sankofa African webinars, where we serve as a platform which is used to bridge the gap between the United States government strategies, the African diaspora, and the African continent. The reason why we are focusing on the United States, the program is about great power strategic relations and policies towards the African continent. That is the purpose of the program. Great power strategic relations towards Africa. And we've been considering that great powers is supposed to be the Chinese, the Americans, the European Union, and the Russians. But for the past 1 year, we focused our attention on the United States. So our discussions have been on the United States. When we are done with the United States, then we go to China. So that is why most of the discussion is going to be within the context of the United States. The United States has got what we call a 3D strategies, which is development, diplomacy, and engagement, and defense. We've dealt extensively with defense, where we've talked about some of the security challenges happening on the African continent. Those of you who are familiar with the AU silencing the guns, in terms of what happens in elections, we discussed what happened in Niger, what happened in Chad, what happened in South Sudan, the election that happened in Senegal, election that is yet to happen in Ghana, election that happened in Kenya, election that happened in South Sudan. So we'll be able to discuss some of these things. And finally, we are moving towards development, where the IMF come to play, IMF and the World Bank come to play a key role. Next week, Friday, we'll be hosting the IMF Director of Prosperity. He is coming to the program to discuss the current events happening on the African continent in terms of what we saw actually happen in Kenya, what happened also in Uganda, and what happened in Nigeria. So it's a process. So now we are on development and how it links to debt, right? So before we proceed, I would like to take your brief opening remarks before we delve into some of the issues. So let me take it from you first. Doc, we want your brief opening remarks in terms of any issue that you want to talk about before we go into our discussion for today. Dr. Jafaru, your brief opening remarks. All right, if it's having problem, Ms. Omamia, can you give me your brief opening remarks for us to proceed?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting us, for this, speaking also on behalf of my colleague who will speak after. So, I mean, this is a very interesting topic in terms of, looking at how the impacts of continued spending on development, especially from an infrastructure perspective, is now impacting or creating some form of economic challenges that sort of exacerbates the security within the country. So it's kind of like a triple challenge or a trilemma, if we can say that, because the topic is trying to balance between spending on infrastructure development, which is much needed to drive economic growth, and how that has sort of led to increase in debts because we have limited fiscal headroom in terms of revenue to fund infrastructure spending. And as a result, there's kind of a shift from focus from much needed spending on other aspects of the economy that is needed to drive growth and development in the near term, because sometimes infrastructure is often a long-term investment that may not yield the results in the short term. And so how that increased in debt, the continued growth in our debt profile has sort of led to increase in our debt servicing to revenue, as well as our debt to revenue has become significantly high, to the point where the government is allocating a significant amount of its budget towards debt servicing. And as a result, that has limited its ability to spend on other much critical sectors that is needed to drive growth. And so in a way, that has led to some challenges within the economy. We like to call them pressure points, where that has led to a lot of pressure points within the economy. And as a result, that has led to more insecurity. So, I mean, I'd like to commend the government, really. I mean, they've tried their best in terms of trying to increase spending on security. I mean, the last 9 years, there's been a lot of focus on spending on security, which has sort of accounted for 12% of our total budgetary allocation. But still, it's not enough. So, I mean, the question of asking, like, what are the security challenges we have within our economy? How much will be needed to be spent, or how much is needed to be spent over maybe the next 1, 2, 3 years to ensure that those security challenges are dealt with? And the security challenges are not just, the issues of, the farmer herders crisis, the terrorist attacks. You also have impact on our economic assets as well in the Niger Delta, which has also affected revenue generation as well. So, I mean, this would be an interesting topic in terms of, how we can balance those issues. How do you balance between that, and where are the revenues even going to come from? How do we think about that? What are the solutions? What are the challenges? So yeah, it's quite an interesting topic, and I'll be interested to hear my, from my colleagues on the call, what they are.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me go to your colleague for a brief opening remarks. You mentioned pressure points, right? I've done a lot of research, so I'm going to bring out all the pressure points that I think there was another report that you presented in June, right? So I've gone through all those pressure points, some of the monetary and fiscal policies, government expenditure, I have all those things over. So we will delve into that later. But let me listen to your colleague also in terms of his opening remarks. Then we'll go to Dr. Jafari. Yeah, your brief opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you, Mr. Jafari and everyone else on the call. I think for me, these are unusual times, interesting times for us as a nation. A lot of pressure on inflation, a lot of pressure on government spending, pressure on the common man. We're dealing with a situation where the food inflation is actually really tough, and food, which should be, a commodity for every man, both rich and poor, right? Now, it was not unexpected that the policy moves that were made by the government would have some short-term effects like this. Fuel subsidy removal, exchange rates unification, and all. Those were good policies if you look at them on the face of it. But we are having a case where we are having policy somersault, right? We know that those policies, we knew it would bring short-term pain, right, on the way to long-term gains. However, government has to walk the talk in Nigeria. we're at a point where a lot of tightening, households are tightening, organizations are tightening. The same is also expected from the public side, right? Because there are two ways really for Nigeria now: earn more money and reduce waste, right? Generate more revenue and reduce waste. That waste reduction, government needs to show more example in that regard. And to also have social buy-in from the people, right? To get them to have some sort of buy-in, a sense of empathy, right? Government has to demonstrate, that prudence, right? That prudence. Aggressive drive for revenue is important. Prudence is also very important. So government needs to walk the talk. And I think that's one element. You can imagine how much, and I wouldn't want to throw out figures, but if and I know that Mr. Jafaroti is laughing because he has those data, right? But I'm sure he himself can tell us that if we can quantify the volume of waste in this country on the government side, that can actually even fund a lot of things, right? In terms of infrastructure, in terms of security, in terms of food and all. So for me, I will start with the word prudence. Government needs to walk the talk. Thank you very much, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go to Dr. Gafari. You listening to all of them. We want your opening remarks, then we delve into the conversation.
Yeah, good evening, gentlemen, Mr. Odulami, my sister Omoshomi, Prof, and other participants. Certainly, we're in a very, very interesting times in this country, because today we navigate the complexities of so much rising debt, and understanding the implications to national security and to overall development of the country is very, very vital. You see, it is really troubling, the way that debt profile of the country keeps rising. In the 80s, our debt was within the range of 5 billion, and around the first term of President Olusegun Obasanjo, now we have seen how they are able to negotiate our debt, and surprisingly, from year 2005, after the exit of the Paris Club, today we have a debt profile of over 100 billion US dollars. It's really, really disturbing. Now, in the year 2023, our debt servicing was put at about 60% of our national debt, of our national budget, robbing other sectors of allocation, especially the security. Today, if you look at the security structure of the country, because of very poor resources, you see how insecurity is rising in this country. If you look at the population of the total number of police personnel we have in Nigeria today, it's not even enough. And even at that, they are not even well equipped. Their welfare is very poor. Same thing with the military and other paramilitary, simply because the resources are not even available. And that Prof, you are putting me in a very difficult situation. I mentioned to you earlier on that.
It is just an opening remarks. We'll delve into other areas so you don't have to go deeper, right? I'll come up with my questions. Right? So you can hold brief, then we'll delve into the program itself. I know it's a very difficult situation, but go ahead.
But certainly, the rising debt profile of this country has so much implications, as because it is so much related to social unrest and instability. You see corruption and governance challenges, regional security implications, and all this. And certainly, we must come with solutions. And I'm certain, perhaps, this our conversation, this webinar will come with very, very useful recommendations for the country. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Right, so let me begin with any of you, right? Now, we all saw what happened in Kenya, right? Before 2024, there were warnings as far back as 2023 in terms of what the government was doing that could lead to what we actually saw, right? There were warnings. People wrote so many articles. Like I said, we've done our discussion program on Kenya. We've had professors who came to the program who were studying the government about certain things that it was doing which were wrong. And the government was not listening. It had to put in the finance bill, and the Daisy started demonstrating. Now, let me come to any of you. On January 30th, 2024, PwC Nigeria, in a report titled Nigeria Economic Outlook, 7 trends that will shape the Nigerian economy. Is it 6 trends that will shape Nigeria's economy in 2024? And you briefly discuss the content of that particular article in terms of what were some of the trends that you brought up in the article that you see playing out now. Any of you can pick it up. Some of the trends that because we discussed some of those trends last week, but because we did not have anybody from PwC Nigeria, we didn't delve into that. But since we have any of you, 2 of you over here, can you discuss the trends that you forecasted were going to impact the Nigerian economy?
Yeah, so I can start. I mean, there was one key thing that my colleague mentioned, talking about balancing fiscal revenue, fiscal prudence with the need to generate more fiscal revenues. And, that ties into one of the trends that we had, when we looked at the 7 trends, which was balancing ambition with budgetary implementation. That's executing fiscal reforms. The government has set targets for itself in terms of how much it wants to grow the economy. This plan about having a $1 trillion economy by 2031. In order for you to be able to achieve that, which is one of the reforms that government is looking at, is you have to be able to spend. Your spending to GDP has to be at a certain percentage to be able to drive economic growth. And one of the challenges about that is that, my colleague has mentioned, fiscal prudence coupled with, fiscal revenue, being able to generate adequate revenue, at the same time being able to eliminate excess spending or wasteful spending that could impact your spending. Your spending has to be prudent. I know one of the things we talked about was that huge revenue ambition realization will be hinged on oil price and oil production dynamics, as well as implementation of fiscal reforms. And we all know that Nigeria's government spending, although there's been a change in terms of the composition of revenue generation in terms of tax versus non-tax revenue, where for the first time, I think 2 years ago, non-oil revenue exceeded oil revenue. I mean, there still needs to be that need for balance between your sources of revenue. And one of the key areas of sources of revenue for the government is the oil sector, the oil and gas sector. And my colleague will shed more light on that in terms of generation of oil revenues. And in order for us to achieve that, I mean, oil revenue is a combination of oil price and oil production. And one of the challenges we've had is that Nigeria's economy is extremely vulnerable to the oil price in the international markets. When prices drop below a certain threshold, it affects government revenues. And then on the other hand, we have the issues of insecurity in the Niger Delta region, which has impacted, production of oil. And then when you now couple up that with a volatile international market, especially with all the geopolitical factors, you have a challenge in terms of oil generation. Then we also talked about public debt. So this first trend looks at the components of government revenue and spending. We talked about the fact that public debt may remain elevated, driven by increased budget deficits. And the fact that because of the need to fund infrastructure spending in the last few years, and also to fund other governments' needs and spending needs, the government's public debt continued to rise. In fact, it was now further worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that COVID-19 pandemic has really had an impact on the global economy, not just Nigeria. But when you have an economy that is not really, in terms of fiscal revenues, you are not even able to have headroom to generate more revenues, and then a lockdown happens caused by a pandemic. Of course, to prevent your economy from completely going into shock, a lot of governments began to spend a lot of money, both from the debt side. Most of those money came from borrowings anyway. I mean, there was funding made, provisioning for funding by the IMF and other multilateral development agencies to countries, just to keep the economies afloat and to support certain sectors and households that were at risk because of the economic lockdown. So that further ballooned, further widened our debt profile, and then increased our debt servicing as a result. So we believe that will remain elevated because of this continuous increase in budget deficit, which my colleague mentioned, lack of fiscal prudence. So you have a budget and then you continue to have high deficits, whereas you should be, and so there are a lot of spending that needs to be prudent in order for you to be able to reduce your deficit, and by default, eliminate any kind of waste that would continue to keep the deficit high. Then, the reforms also that will shape the economy, which I've mentioned. And so for government to be able to spend more, they are limited. I'm not sure there's even headroom to spend, because revenues are sort of limited now. And because of the economic challenges, the opportunity to even generate more is further limited. So those are that's one of the trends that we looked at. Yeah.
Right. So let me follow up on you, right? So the 7 trends that you listed, you mentioned somewhere that has to do with consumer bearing what? Increase in prices of goods and services, right?
Yeah.
And that was as a result of the government taking away the subsidies, right? And that is why people took to the street. So my question is, why were people surprised, since this forecast has already been made way in advance that this was going to be the economic impact of the government taking away the subsidy on petroleum products? Why were people so surprised, even though you have been able to make that forecast in advance?
So I mean, the surprise came from the fact that, there was an underestimation of the impacts that removal of subsidy would have on the economy, right? I mean, when you look at case studies of countries that have had subsidies in one form or the other, in some countries, subsidies exist in different forms in different countries. Some have petrol, like Nigeria. There are others that have subsidies on wheat, subsidies on commodities, different commodities. I don't think that any country has really successfully been able to remove subsidies without having challenge. Removal of subsidy, coupled with the fact that the exchange rate was defied, that challenge also had an impact. Remember when the subsidy was removed, the price of petrol is a function of both exchange rates and also the international price in the oil markets. There are other factors that go into that. And so as a result of that, when the exchange rate was liberalized, that had an effect, because there's a supply demand, the market, the exchange rate market is a function of supply and demand, right? Demand for foreign exchange coupled with supply. Now, because of the fact that we are not a productive economy in the sense that our exports are largely driven by oil, and we don't have non-oil exports that drive the generation of foreign exchange. There's not much we export to be able to earn foreign exchange. Supply demand, there's a supply demand gap in the market. And Nigeria is also an importing country. We depend on imports for consumption, domestic consumption. So not just even consumption of finished products, but even the manufacturing sector depends on imports of raw materials. So when you have all that demand within the sector. And then everything, even the services we rely on also are imported. So when you have a huge demand with an insufficient supply to meet that demand gap, then what you will have is that there will be, the exchange rates will continue to devalue against the naira, the foreign exchange rate. And if you import your petrol, because one of our major imports is petrol. My colleague will shed more light on that. One of our major imports is petrol. Even though we are a major exporter of oil, we import our refined petroleum. And so as a result of that, when you need exchange rates to import, and the body that imports refined petroleum, right, is not generating enough revenues to be able to purchase that, then you now have a net deficit effect where they are not able to buy, you know, the petroleum product. So the removal of petroleum subsidy was not well thought out, if I could say that, because you need to first of all measure the impact of that removal on the economy. So that led to those, that's what led to those triple pressure points, right? Because the government on the one hand has a dilemma where they have limited revenues, right, to continue to fund subsidies. And so they have to remove subsidies in order to have revenues to spend on other critical sectors. And so in removing that subsidy, the price of petrol is now higher. That's the petrol product is now higher for the domestic consumers. And because there's an impact already of exchange rates, there's not enough, you know, to import products. And then coupled with the fact that petroleum prices are higher, all that will now combine to have an effect on retail goods and services. You know that petrol is one of the key inputs that sets the prices for other products in the economy. You know, you need petrol for transport, you need petrol for manufacturing, you need it for other things. And so with the exchange rate being devalued, that raised the price of petroleum, that's import of refined petroleum, coupled with lower revenues to cover that. And you see the issues that that combined to lead to the shock that happened within the economy.
Okay, all right. No, before I come to some of the pressure points, let me go to Doc, right? So you heard Omomia make the argument that removal of subsidy was not well thought out, right? Now, somewhere this year, there was this slogan, let the poor breathe, let the poor breathe. So if you say you want the poor to breathe, was it a well thought out policy to take off the subsidy from the petroleum product, which will create more hardship for the poor people, right? You are in government, you've been in government, right? So what was the thinking behind it, behind the slogan, let the poor breathe? How do you expect the poor to breathe when you have taken away the subsidy, which makes their life a little bit more easier? We just want to understand what went into that thinking. Apart from, I can make the case that the government was thinking about reducing the debt, right? So if some people make the argument that, okay, you could cut down expenditure to reduce the debt, but cutting down expenditure means what? You are depriving people of critical government services, right? So you cannot have it both ways. So Dr. Dafaru, can you explain to us why let the poor breathe and that policy of removing the subsidy? What went into that?
Well, Prof, as it is, even the rich, they don't breathe well. No, matter of fact, I'm saying this because this will affect all of us. All of us. And as you can see, reality is the government has very, very low revenue. I have worked in the Revenue Mobilization, Allocation, and Fiscal Commission for 23 years. And that, I know that in the last 13 years, you know, there is never a year that we, in fact, there's never a month that we produce up to 1.7 million barrels of crude oil per day. In the last 7 years, it was always within the range of 1.3, which is, in fact, 1.3, 1.5. Now, in the last 2 years, usually 1.2. Some few months ago, we're even happy that it is now increased to about 1.5. And even that 1.5, is not 100% that is for the federation. There's a production sharing contract. So under the production sharing contract, certainly a certain amount goes to the IOCs. And again, whatever accrued into the federation account, again, there's also a revenue sharing formula. The federal government gets only 52.6% of all the revenues that accrued into the federation account. So sincerely, it was originally a function of revenue, thinking that by removing the subsidy, government will even have more to invest in infrastructure and social services. And unfortunately, it is not so.
So,
Odulabi, you want to come in, right?
Yeah, if I may come in, thank you,
yeah,
Mr.
yes,
Jamiu.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I think at this point, it's even difficult to know where you fall in, whether you are in the category of the poor that is not breathing or the rich not breathing.
The rich that is not breathing.
Because the middle class is literally eroding, right? We did an analysis recently and we looked at the income pyramid. You'll be shocked that based on some 5 years ago, your income that will classify you as middle class some 5 years ago, if you earn that same income now, you probably will be classified as, lower class at the moment. So some people that were rich are now getting to middle class. But you see, the thing, just back to your earlier question to Omomia, with respect to the fuel subsidy, right? I think the first thing we didn't really consider well is our very high energy dependence in Nigeria, or petrol dependence. And here's what I mean. If you look at our petrol consumption, right, in Nigeria, I would estimate about 30% to 35% of that actually goes to captive power generation. People will use it to fuel their generators at home. Businesses will use to fuel generator. If you go to diesel, it's probably going to be a little higher, right? And so compared to other countries, right, you can hardly live in Nigeria without buying petrol, whether rich or poor. You can live in the United States and not buy petrol if you don't own a car, because you don't need petrol to power your house, right? In Nigeria, almost everybody, right, depends on it in one way or the other. Same with diesel, right? So if you have a situation where with the epileptic power supply in the country, right, the average person has to depend on petrol to power their houses, and they need petrol to move their cars because we do not have an effective mass transportation system, right? So when you combine those two, the impact of fuel subsidy removal is going to bite really hard, because you can hardly avoid the impact, whether directly from your direct purchase or even indirectly, because even the SMEs you patronize, small, medium scales, the barber uses petrol for his generator, the woman who is going to grind your pepper uses petrol for the small grinding machine, everything, right? There's a huge dependency, right? So I think that one of the priorities has to be to get electricity, which electricity is even largely subsidized, right? Until recently, where there are band classifications and all, right? A lot of focus has to go into getting the power sector to work. The gas to power value chain has to work, because if that value chain works, electricity will be generated more at a larger scale, right? It will be cheaper buying from the grid. It is definitely cheaper than buying from the grid than you spend, right, on captive power generation, right? So in that case, you cut down even the volume, right, of consumption and importation, right, of petroleum products, right? First of all, you cut down the impact on everyone, right? Where we know that we would, we rely more on petroleum products to drive our cars, right? And then the government is trying to do a lot about gas and all. Now, when you go into revenue generation, like Dr. Jafaru has rightly stated, right, we are struggling in terms of the volume of production. I have always maintained that there is absolutely no reason but for, self-inflicted issues there's no reason why we should not be doing 2 million barrels per day as a country. There is no reason. I've been to Norway. I've been to the Petroleum Museum in Norway, you know, on several study assignments, right? Norway, as small as the nation is generating 2 million barrels at the least per year. Norway has a thriving fishery industry. And I recall that as of the time we went, we were told that their fishing industry was earning them yearly about well over $20 billion. Fishing.
But hold on. So you hold a view that the government should be pumping more oil?
You know, that's a very, I understand where your question is going to. It's a very touching thing when we talk of environmental sustainability.
Correct,
But
yeah.
the reality is Africa as of today, right? We need the money from oil to be able to stabilize our economy and invest in other sources of energy. The money from oil and gas, right? We need to, and that's a mistake we made as a country. The money we made from these sources, we failed to invest them. We spent them rather than invest them in the future.
Yeah, but my question has to do with, you have to meet certain OPEC conditions. You just cannot be pumping so much into the system so the price of oil products goes down on the world market.
We're not even meeting our OPEC quota.
Okay.
We're not even meeting our OPEC quota. So it's not even just pumping anyhow, right? And if you then look at, like Dr. Jafaru has said, if you then look at the government take, which is on average about 50 to 60% of our daily production, a number of, the government take, recent estimates put it as well over $200,000 have gone into, crude oil for dollar deals, right? Some of the forward contracts, right? Over 200,000 barrels per day already has gone into that. So you see that even the little that is left for us is not enough to generate the revenue that we need. Now, of course, taxation is an option, but you tax a productive economy, right, to continue to build the economy. If the economy is not productive, it is difficult to tax because you can't tax what is empty. You can't tax what is, because tax is based on profits, based on income, based on consumption, right? So we need to get the economy to work so that we can even tax more, right? So talking about the implication on the common man, these are the reasons why it is biting harder. And on the other hand, revenue, is not increasing, right? And even the petrol price, as you have it today, right? The pump price of average of 600 naira per liter, depending on what part of the country where you are, some parts is more, right? Is actually subsidized.
All right, so let me get back to Dr. Yeflor, right? Now, they published, PwC published another article which has to do with pressure points, right? Now, I'll read over the pressure point. I'll follow up with questions. Between May 2023 and May 2024, the average PMC price surged by 211% due to fuel subsidy removal. The NPR increased by 775 basis points to combat inflation, which rose from 22.4% to 33.69%. And the Naira depreciated by 67.8% following forex market liberalization. The changes in the key reform indicators imply that economy may face slower growth, reduced consumer purchasing power, and increased cost of living, necessitating robust policy intervention to stabilize the economy. So the government took steps, right? Physical steps. It has physical steps and monetary steps. So I want us to look at some of the physical steps the government took. Deregulation of PMC to reduce government spending and redirect resources to other critical sectors. PM subsidy was removed in May 2023, resulting in an increase in the price of PMC from 187 naira to 630 naira. However, even though the subsidy has been removed, look at what the IMF is saying. However, the IMF reported that the PMS is still sold at a lower than the market price, effectively maintaining a partial subsidy. So even though we are saying that the subsidy has been taken off, the IMF is still saying that the price is still what? Lower. That means the government is still maintaining a partial subsidy. That means something still must be done in order to bear the actual cost of what? Petroleum products. This is the IMF talking. Would you agree with such a statement that still there's a partial subsidy on petroleum products?
You see, sir, once you peg the price of PMS, you know, PMS today is a product that is not refined in this country. It is still imported. Now, the value of Naira, the exchange rate of Naira to a dollar in May 2023 is not the same as today. Yesterday, I bought a liter of fuel in Abuja at 960 Naira per liter. You know, so it is still function of the forex. I mean, the value of the currency. So long as Naira keeps depreciating, certainly, no matter how much the cost of PMS is pegged, after a week, 2-3 weeks, once Naira crashes again, the price of PMS will still go up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let me come back to Omomia, right? Some of the key insight, because Dr. Jafaru talked about the exchange rate. So let me look at some of the key insights on the exchange rate. Official exchange rate depreciated by 67.8% from 461.121 Naira in May 2023 to 14338 in May 2024. The decline in the value of the Naira was partly due to the widening gap between dollar supply and demand. What is the reason? What is causing this higher demand for dollar in Nigeria?
So, you know, like I mentioned earlier, Nigeria is not, in terms of production, you know, Kola had mentioned some of the, you know, insights from his trip to Norway and, you know, how productive that economy, if I just one sector of the economy and how much exports that is generating alone for that economy that is not even up to maybe the population of Nigeria in terms of our size. So, I mean, even though we have a well-diversified economy, right, our exports are not well-diversified. Our productive base itself is already low in terms of the fact that if you even look at our GDP growth, most of the sectors that are driving growth are not the sectors that produce goods more or less. It's the services sector that drives much of our growth you get in the economy.
Yeah.
And so we are not producing anything that we can export that can generate sufficient foreign exchange for the economy, you know, to be able to drive economic production. So when you look at the fact that in terms of exports, most of our exports are commodities, right? Agricultural commodities, they are not value added, and the commodities themselves are not even a lot to generate enough export revenues for the economy, coupled with the fact that, you know, like my colleagues mentioned the production parts, and then the fact that we are not able to generate enough to be able to even get more. I mean, if you have an economy, a part of the economy that is productive, you will try to boost that side so that it funds the other aspects of the economy that needs to be developed in order to be able to become more productive. So when you have the issue of the fact that we don't produce much that is enough to generate export revenues, and what we consume is mostly imported. We're import dependent. Even the petroleum products that Mr. Jamilu and Kola mentioned, they are not, how would I put it? They are not even enough, as in the export is not enough to even boost production of the other parts of the economy. So that low productive base coupled with an import dependent economy is what has created a supply demand gap. I mean, there was some statistical estimates that even showed that we are not only even importing products, we're also importing services. When you think about the brain drain, the Japa syndrome that happened in the last 3 years, where a lot of our Nigerians emigrated to other countries abroad, the money that they needed to fund some of that relocation, like education, was significant, and that also had an impact on our forex supply in terms of the huge demand that required. Then coupled with the fact that most people travel abroad for medical services, so a lot of those services, those are what you call imported invisible goods that we are importing. And then you now look at our manufacturing sector, even the ones that are functioning, they import their raw materials, they import the intermediate products for local production. Then you talk about retail services. Much of what the retail services use is when you look at the shelves, a lot of the products you find in our supermarkets are imported. You know, when you talk about even our sector, like even the wines, the spirits, you know, all the things that, you know, we rely upon for local consumption is imported. So when you look at that, the supply-demand gap, the demand for exchange rate coupled with the supply is significantly, you know, wide. In fact, Nigeria was subsidizing our foreign exchange, if I'm to put it that way. The same way we're subsidizing petrol, we're subsidizing foreign exchange. The reason why our foreign exchange remained relatively stable for the period that it did was because the Central Bank of Nigeria was funding the supply side, funding the demand side of the markets. So we're subsidizing foreign exchange. And when the revenues that you're generating from oil and other, you know, government exports are not sufficient enough to meet the demand, the widening demand for forex, because you have not reformed the economy to the point where we are able to export significantly enough to cover supply. So what now happens is that because the government could no longer supply the demand side, they had to liberalize the markets. And so that was sort of like saying, in a way, removing subsidies on petrol, on forex, although from time to time, they also try to, you know, prevent further shocks by funding the markets. You know, they still fund the markets in a sense, but so that's part of the supply-demand gap that has led to the fact that our currency has remained unstable and volatile, and the exchange rate continues to devalue, or our naira continues to devalue against other foreign currencies.
Right, thank you very much. Let me follow up with Doc, right? She mentioned our Greek sector. I want to read some of the key insights on our Greek sector. So the government embarked on a dry season farming, distribution of rice, fortified crops, seeds, fertilizer, and improved farmland security to combat food inflation and enhance production. Now, the problem that people will say is that we have become what? Import dependent. We saw in the 80s where we're trying to do what they call an ISI, import substitution industry, to be able to bring machines to some of the goods that we're importing to produce them locally. And we saw what happened. So the question is, has the government of Nigeria failed to take advantage of the first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, third industrial revolution, right? To industrialize, to produce those high-tech machines that will be needed in Nigeria in the agri sector, instead of trying to import some of these practices or these hardcore machines into the country, which will lead to debt and lead to what you call inflation in the country. Has the government over the years done enough, right, to boost industrialization, to produce those high-tech machines that we need based on what happened in the 80s in terms of the ISI? Have we been able to do that?
You know, you see, this thing is a process. It's a process. Now, I am aware that Nigerian government has they are working on this because they have an existing plan, the NIRP, National Industrial Revolutions Plan, and the National and NEDEP, National Entrepreneurial Development Plan, and that part of this is part of the plan is what they have now started. Now they're forming clusters of the farmers. You know, first and foremost, you must be able to grow the crops first. After growing the crops, then you beneficiate and you know, process. So now what the government is doing at the moment is trying to increase the production first. You know, you must produce for you to even process. We don't even have enough at the moment. What is produced is not even enough for our own consumption. What more processing, you know, and export and what have you. That is it.
But the point is, until we are not even able to produce enough, right? And we are not able to have the machines to actually process them. Because when you are dealing in primary products, we know that primary products, the prices fluctuate on the world market, right? So the point is, there should be that serious industrial policy to be able to create these machines, right? Because let's talk about importing some of these hard, intensive capital machines into the country. These are in foreign currency, and it's going to put pressure on your already limited or scarce foreign exchange reserves. So how fast shouldn't the government be expediting action on these things in terms of a serious industrial revolution that the Chinese did? Shouldn't we be taking a cue from the Chinese rather than taking this slow pace? Because one thing about African governments is that they don't want to do the difficult job. We don't want to do the hard work. We always want to find an easy way. Instead of doing the hard work to produce, why don't we import and bring those things into the country? And it's affecting our economy. What's your take on that?
You see, it's two ways. Nigeria operates a federating system of government. You know, the federal government and the sub-nations. And some states are doing exactly what you have mentioned. Like Gombe State, I know that the governor of Gombe State is establishing an industrial park. You know, he has carved out 1,000 hectares parcel of land. He's developing, you know, for an industrial park. So far now, he has achieved 75%. You know, the governor of Niger, that one too, I know, is doing a lot on that in that aspect. Same thing with the governor of Bauchi State. And I think in the south, the government of Ogun State, I was told that they're doing this kind of drive. So slowly we get there.
Okay.
But certainly it will not. It's not something that can be done within few weeks, months. You know, it's something that will take a long period of time to materialize.
Right. So let me come to your color, right? So this is Nigeria's public debt as at 31st March 2024, right? So I'll give you the breakdown, external debt and domestic debt, and I'll relate it to an article that Professor Adigbete wrote in 2008 and see whether what she was writing at that time and what is happening in Nigeria right now is the reality. So the external debt is, in terms of percentage, it's almost 46%, right? It gives you the amount in dollars, but the total external debt is 46% and total domestic debt is 53.9% as at March 2024. Right. Now I want us to look at the article that she wrote. Right. She said what? She was writing article the external debt on economic development, published by the International Journal for Emerging Markets, which basically was trying to investigate the impact of huge external debt and debt servicing requirements on economic growth on Nigerian economy, right? This is what she writes. The article reads, external debt can be viewed as a means of financing capital formation. Then she said, according to Adepoju, developing countries in Africa, such as Nigeria, are characterized by inadequate internal capital formation due to the various cycle of low productivity, low income, and low savings. This situation therefore calls for technical, managerial, and financial support from abroad to bridge the resource gap. On the other hand, external debt as a major constraint. On the other hand, external debt acts as a major constraint to capital formation in Nigeria. The burden and dynamics of external debt show that they do not contribute significantly to financing economic development in developing countries. Let me read that part again. He said what? The burden and dynamics of external debt show that they do not contribute significantly to financing economic development in developing countries. Now, looking at Nigeria's external debt, which is almost 47%, would you agree what she is saying, that the burden and dynamics of external debt show that they do not contribute significantly to financing economic development? Would you agree with that?
I think it's neither here nor there. Debt itself is not a problem, right? It is the deployment, the efficient use of the debt. So the only way I can agree with her is if we then say that in the context of how the debt has been used, right? If it's a thing of we've received those debts and we've seen it as free money, rather than spending for development, right? We've spent for personal use, right? Or they've been spent for unnecessary items. Then the debt becomes a problem. But in terms of debt itself, some countries that we know, developed countries, have been transformed through debt. America, some of the biggest countries we know in the world, are heavily indebted, right? So public debt is not in itself an issue. The issue is the use of the debt, number one. Number two, then maybe covenants that may come with the debts, depending on the nature of the debt. So if you go to the negotiation table, for example, some of the things that I know that these are desperate times and they require desperate measures, but I think that for example, the crude deals, the crude for dollar deals we're having in the country have to be looked into deeply. I do not have the details, and I'm sure maybe people like Dr. Jafaru may do, but if you look, sometimes when you hear, the amount in dollars and you're trying to reconcile it with the volume of crude oil production that is tied to for the repayment of that amount, you are trying to ask yourself, are we really sure that this makes sense? So, because you're trying to tie it down to, okay, let's even say what can be the interest rates. Could it be that they, of course, discounted the value of the crude, right? And these are the things, right? So it is the terms and conditions, the covenants. While we go to the negotiation table at this point, desperately in need of help, we must also keep our dignity as a country, right? We don't have to sell the house, right, to get a meal. Right? Again, we don't have to sell the house to get lunch. We need lunch. We may need to sell some things at this point, to be honest, to get lunch, but we don't have to sell the whole house. So it's a question of the terms and conditions and the deployment. But public debt itself is not an issue.
Okay, now, thank you very much for that. Let me come to Dr. Jafaru. Right, he is making the argument that public debt itself is not bad, but it's a deployment. Now, we know that there are some debts which are project specific. You go and borrow money or loans for certain projects, right? So that those projects you can easily trace and evaluate. But sometimes we go and borrow money which are not for projects, which goes into the consolidated fund. When it gets in over there, tracking it to what it has been used for becomes a problem. So is it high time that we consider borrowing for projects alone, instead of going to borrow, putting the money in the federal coffers, then the money will not go into people's private pocket?
Well, from what I know, for long, most borrowings that governments do are budget specific, are project specific. Most of these loans are tied to projects. This is what I know. Yeah, and of course, we have even started seeing positive results from some of these debts. Like the infrastructure project financed by like the Kaduna Abuja Train Services You know, that one too was, you know, was funded using the debt. You know, and that, well, like I said earlier, now the loans I know that governments take are tied to projects.
Right, so let me follow up. So based on your analysis, do you think that Nigeria has borrowed enough to finance its own infrastructure development? Looking at the infrastructure gap that we have in Nigeria, do you think the amount that we have borrowed so far, if I can check again, is around 121? Did it say what? 91.4 billion. Do you think that we have borrowed enough? Looking at, if you are talking about most of the money is being borrowed for infrastructure projects, and looking at the infrastructure gap that we have in Nigeria, right? In terms of power systems, right? In terms of electricity, in terms of railways, in terms of airports, right? Do you think that we have borrowed enough? Let me give you a very good example, right? In the case of Ethiopia had to get bonds to the tune of almost like $4.7 billion for their jet project, which is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the dam that they are building to supply electricity. Do you think that Nigeria should be borrowing on a larger scale, huge amount of money to finance its infrastructure development? Because this infrastructure development creates jobs. It's able to attract foreign direct investment into the country. So do you think that Nigeria has borrowed enough?
Prof, I cannot say Nigeria has borrowed enough. We have not borrowed enough, but in the interim, we have to suspend this borrowing. Let's assess, let's see how we're able to deliver, you know, the infrastructure with, you know, we borrowed money for some infrastructure. Let's finish them off before we go for another one. After all, governance is a continuum. You know, no governor or no president will say, I want to take care of all these things today or within my tenure of office. It's a continuum, you know. So I think we should just put a cap. Then look inward. Look inward. For example, now, we can now say, within the country, you know, we look at some, for example, in road sector, we look at road construction companies that are viable. We say, okay, now we are considering certain, you know, highways to them. Let them, let them reconstruct and take their money over a period of time. We do not necessarily have to go back to the, you know, IMF, World Bank, and these, institutions for. We can even do it, you know, internally.
Okay. That is a very interesting observation. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me throw some perspectives. I think the question is not whether Nigeria has borrowed enough. I think the question is whether Nigeria has attracted enough capital.
Correct.
And capital is not always debt, right? Capital for infrastructure development can come from our revenue, right? It can come from debt. It can come from private capital. If we create the enabling environment, we can attract private sector capital, even for public infrastructure, right? Turnkey arrangements, you know, PPP arrangements, and all of those, right? As far as you can de-risk those investments, the private sector, capital is always looking for the market that will attract it, right? If we make our market de-risk. So it's not necessarily a question of debt. I think the issue we've always had as a country, and due respect, you know, to everyone involved, is that it appears that our default mode when we want to attract capital is we just think about debt.
The debt, correct.
Right. We need to think about how do we form capital, how do we attract capital, right, sustainably beyond debt.
Right. So let me come to Omomia, right? Dr. Jafari was making the argument that it's most of the time it's project. We should look inwards, right? We should try to look inwards in terms of how we can be able to raise capital to finance development project. That brings into question the PPP, public-private partnership, right, which is basically internally, right? And we know that that is where most of the corruption comes, because when government contracts are given out to contractors, that is when politicians tend to demand a certain percentage compared to when the capital or the debt or the money borrowed is coming from overseas. Would you agree to that? Borrowing internally is able to exacerbate what? Corruption compared to what? Money borrowed for projects which are coming from overseas, which has very strict conditions.
So I mean, it's important to also borrow domestically because I'm not like a debt expert, but I know that there is a debt consolidation strategy that every country has in terms of the composition of their domestic to foreign debt that they must have. And like you rightly said, foreign debts are beneficial in the sense that it kind of provides you with, you are borrowing in foreign exchange in dollars, that when you convert to Naira, it provides more money for you to spend in terms of for much needed domestic needs. And then it depends also on the type of loan. You have loans that come from the multilateral and bilateral agencies that are often low interest and long tenured, right? And then you also have the one that the government accesses through the debt capital markets, where they go and they issue bonds, government bonds for a longer term. And as a result of that longer term debt, they pay interest rates at a regular basis to those that have invested in those bonds. For domestic debt, I mean, there are benefits to borrowing domestically as well. The fact that there is an opportunity for you to negotiate better terms, right? In terms of all these covenants and contracts that are tied to some of these foreign loans sometimes can also have impact on the domestic economy if the economy is not well, in terms of the government has not created the foundation of the economy to be able to absorb some of the covenants and contracts that they have to abide by. Sometimes these foreign debtors will tell you, okay, if we are going to give you this money, you have to remove subsidies, you have to increase taxes on certain, because for them, the guarantee is that they want you to pay back as at when due and on a regular basis. So they provide you with areas where you need to free up money to repay those debts. So they tell you, oh, you can try to remove subsidies, or you have to privatize certain sectors, or you have to raise taxes, as you mentioned the case with Kenya. I mean, Kenya has a high debt and they need to borrow more. And in order to be able to access that debt, probably one of the conditions that was given is that they had to, increase taxes and expand their tax base to other areas in order to generate revenues to be able to pay back that debt. And this led to, I mean, the protests that we saw over those couple of weeks in Kenya, because I mean, the people that are going to tax don't, that they are already indebted to the government. You are now trying to give them extra tax burden, when there's a high unemployment, when the minimum wage is still low, and there's not a lot of how will I put it? There's not a lot of room for them. When you have high inflation, high spending, and your personal income is not rising to cover your expenditure, and then you are now wanting to tax me the more. I mean, that heated the policy and caused a lot of the social unrest we saw in Kenya. So I mean, debt in itself, like my colleagues have said, Dr. Jamilu and Kola have said, is that it's not a bad thing. It's how you spend the debt, and even how you structure the debt in terms of, like you rightly said, there needs to be, when you talk about contracts, there needs to be due process. I mean, I know that we had the due process office that came up under, I think, President Obasanjo. You have the Bureau of the Office of Public Procurement. So, I mean, there's a lot of that fiscal prudence comes in, where you say, okay, if you are going to borrow, what are you borrowing for? The borrowing has to be tied to projects, and projects that will yield return on investment in the short to medium term, right? So when you are borrowing, what are you borrowing to fund? that is where you now have to map your borrowings to projects. So project tied borrowings, so that in a way you are able to eliminate all that wastage. And then when you now look at the what you are funding, you have to also assess, like you said, there has to be due process. There has to be an assessment of the contract that is being awarded or that the loan is tied to ensure that that contract, there are no leakages or wastages within those contracts that would cause the loan itself to be wasted. So those are some of the things where, you have to start thinking about how do we improve on internal processes? How do we ensure that there's transparency? How do you remove all the bureaucratic bottlenecks, all the red tapes that come with contract award, and even the costing and estimation of the contracts that are awarded? So those are some of the things that government has to look into, come up with policies and strategies that they need to so on the spending side, the contracts that you're awarding have to eliminate all kinds of leakages and wastages, so that the loans are maximized to the use to what they were borrowed for. So and that the projects themselves, the return on investment on those projects sort of pays for the loan. So I mean, and that's where privatization comes in, I mean, one of the medium-term national plan that came under the last administration, one of the things they said was that the growth in the economy will be led 70% by the private sector, 30% by the public. So private sector-led growth. And you see that those are ways you eliminate leakages, where you privatize certain assets that would yield revenues to the private sector to run. When the private sector is running something, they are profit-oriented, so they create efficiencies within the system, and they ensure that everything works smoothly. There's a maintenance culture, and that so government moved from being business oriented to being playing more of a regulatory role, where you regulate certain sectors. So what are the assets that government own? Can they privatize those assets so that the private sector can come in and maximize efficiency on those sectors? And when they privatize certain sectors and assets, that's kind of, and then they do the role of regulator. So I mean, the private sector pays tax on those assets, and government also makes sure that they do not become more profit oriented to the point that they overprice the public for the use of those services. So government needs to shift from a business mindset to more of a regulator, because I mean, history has shown that government cannot effectively manage some of those resources that they own. I mean, if you look at some of the examples, like in oil and gas, they need to privatize some of these assets. If you look at the example of I think it's Saudi Arabia, where they privatized Saudi Aramco. They privatized a percentage of the equity ownership of their oil and gas company. And look at how much revenues they were able to generate from the sale on that asset. So government has a lot of assets that are all over the country that, they don't even keep account of. If you go to Lagos, you see a lot of abandoned buildings that are actually owned by government. You see them on the island. If you actually value those assets, they run into the billions and millions of naira. Buildings that maybe when they moved from Lagos to Abuja as a seat of power, those buildings were left there. There are a lot of houses that government own across Lagos. I think it was in the last administration that they did sort of like, they've started to build an asset register when they are starting to keep account of the things that they own, the government balance sheets. And that's when they came up in the newspaper with a list of houses that they own all over Lagos and the country. And people have occupied those houses. Those houses have been sold, and government gave eviction notices. So there's a lot of land assets that government own, land, buildings, state-owned enterprises, state-owned assets. If they quantify those assets alone, I mean, recently we're talking about one of the accounts of one of the state-owned enterprise, and they looked at the assets. It ran into trillions of naira. That's just for one state-owned enterprise. So if imagine if they look at the other ones and all the assets that government own and quantify it, that's enough to generate significant revenue for government. I know that PwC, we did a report, a few years ago, talking about dead assets, how there's a lot of assets that are not being unlocked or maximized that government owns, land, house, agriculture, all those things. And if government privatizes those assets, privatize, lease, sell, all kinds of things. I mean, look at the telecom sector under Obasanjo. Telecoms was largely state-owned, Nitel. And then the government came in and privatized the telecoms industry. And today, we know what the value of that industry is and how much it generates to GDP. So those are assets that can be maximized to generate revenues. So those are some thoughts we can think about on how to, free up those revenues and also manage contracts to ensure that our funds are not wasted. Yeah.
All right, so Dr. Jaffer, listening to Omomia, right? What do you have to say? Is that government has to divest its interest, right? To move away from that business mindset to become more of a regulator, right? Divest most of its assets to the private sector. But the private sector is able to run some of these assets more efficiently than government. So government should move away from that business mindset. Okay, government is doing business instead of being more of what? A regulator in the capitalist market. Would you agree to that? You've muted your microphone. Unmute your microphone.
Well, I completely agree with her position. Government shall hand off, management of their businesses. And government shall hands off this.
The point is that it is very difficult if you look at the history, where the history of colonial legacies, right? Government finds it very, very difficult divesting its interest, right? Also, sometimes you see people in government who have businesses. They have their own business and they keep awarding contracts to themselves. It's either you are in government or you are in the private sector. You can't be in government at the same time be in the private sector where you are awarding contracts to yourself. So it's either you are a regulator completely out of the private sector, or people go into the private sector. That's a challenge that most African countries are having. There's no clear distinction between the government, who is a policy formulator, and the government which is implementing the policy, right? Government is basically doing everything. We shouldn't have a situation where people in government are awarding contracts to their own businesses.
Nigeria's extant laws has actually prohibited public officers from doing business. You have to choose one, whether you are in business or you are in government. And it is very unethical, for anyone to take advantage of his position and award contract to cronies or to himself.
No, but they wouldn't be doing that. They'll have what? Politically exposed persons, their family members, extended family members who create these businesses, and they give some of these contracts to them, which is nepotism, right? We've seen this situation across the whole of the African continent.
That is very wrong. That is wrong.
So, but how do we have what special mechanisms and processes in trying to check some of these unethical conflict of interest situations? Do we have strong mechanisms and processes in Nigeria? Because what I'm saying here is that the legacies that we inherited from the British, we have not actually departed from it. We've not created our own administrative processes. We are continuing with what the British left for us. So people go into public office and they see public office as their personal property. Right? This is what happens. It's mostly a group of people who are either in the military or who belong to a particular religious orientation or a particular ethnic group who tend to be benefiting at the expense of the majority of the people. Because given the resources that we have in Nigeria, people should not be begging on the street of Nigeria. People should not be protesting because of bad economic situation. What could be the reason why majority of the people in Nigeria are so poor when we have so much resources so much, so abundant that we can use it to the benefit for everybody. What could explain that?
Well, two things. You see, it's a matter of conscience. It's a matter of conscience. If you are in authority or if you are in position of power, you know that that one is a trust. And it is really, really unethical, to, of course, breach that trust, certainly. And in Nigeria, I know we have extant laws. The code of conduct is there, the public service rule, all the rules are there, and they frown at it, but they sanction it. It is sanctioned. And again, on the part of the led, now once the leader does so, there's also the need on the part of the led to demand for good governance. So you see, there's this perception in Nigeria that everything that belongs to government, we do not own it. It is only in typical of us here. I don't know in other parts of the world, but in Nigeria today, so if you construct a borehole, if government constructs borehole for public, now come back after 6 months, that borehole will get spoiled. If it is dug by by a private individual who is digging borehole and who is selling water, come in the next 10 years, nothing will happen to it.
Right.
Go to our public, go out to our healthcare institutions. The same thing. There's a federal teaching hospital I know that I know for about 7 times, they have been receiving donations of dialysis machine, but there's never a year that one dialysis machine lasts for 6 months.
Right. So that is basically what I'm saying. Let me go to Okolawale, right? So what I'm saying here is that Doc raised the issue of a bad maintenance culture, right? We are not able to maintain this thing. And I'm saying that these things were legacies of the colonial system. These were things that we inherited from the colonial system. What have we changed, right? To be able to resolve some of these things where people see public access not to be maintained. We should be able to change that culture, but that culture came from the colonial era that we have inherited. What have we done over the past 60 years to be able to move away to make sure that some of these things have good maintenance? People in public office are held accountable. People in public office are very transparent in their dealings with government or with individuals or private sectors. What have we done so far?
I mean, I wasn't born in the colonial era,
Correct.
if I may say, but from the little I have heard and read about the colonial era, I think it's actually the opposite. The maintenance culture was better then than it is now. At least people like Dr. Jafaru, who are people from that era, can testify. But I know what we hear was that at that time, Nigerians were a bit more cultured. Things were done a bit more properly. I think a lot of the degradation started mostly between the 80s and now. But that notwithstanding, right, I think that it's not just maintenance culture, it's 2 things. One, poor quality in the infrastructure. So you see a road awarded for billions of naira, and even from the very day the road is constructed, you look at this and you can say, no, this cannot be. You can almost tell that the integrity of that project is questioned, and you can almost tell yourself that over the next couple of years, this thing will not last. Some of the strongest infrastructure we have now were built, even pre-independence. Some of them are still standing. Some of those that were built in the 70s, look at the National Stadium, for example, right? No, the National Theater, for example. The look and feel got dilapidated, right, due to bad maintenance, but you can still tell the integrity of the structure, right? Now they've renovated it. Most of the renovation work that was done was to make it look finer, more modern, but the structure itself is still standing, right? So there's one thing, the integrity of, the engineers, the integrity of those who are delivering for us, ensuring the quality of the infrastructure. The second thing is about we as a people, having that culture, knowing that what's for the public is for all of us, right? Knowing that what's for the public is for all of us. I mean, when you have people, for example, Third Mainland Bridge that was constructed or renovated, if I may say. Just earlier this year or last year, we had cases of people going there to steal materials almost the very week after it was reopened. You know, that's not good enough for us as a country. You can't have people going there to remove street lights, people attempting to cut, you know, expansion joints. We've seen cases of railways, you know, that people are attempting to steal the steel from the railway to go and sell. You know, that's barbaric, to say the least, right? So the citizenry also have a role to play. Of course, there's a lot of hunger and desperation, right? But doing those things is not actually the way out, because how much would you even get from them anyway?
Yeah, but do we need to be blaming the citizens, or should we blaming the system that has been created that put them in that kind of situation? Because look at the abundant resources that we have in Nigeria. Should people be living certain lives they live?
Well, the system comprises the people and many other factors, right? So there is a systemic change that needs to happen in the country,
Okay.
right? And if we must be honest, to transform Nigeria will not take a year or two. It will take, you know, a long term. And this is where I think we are missing it as a country. It's that lack of continuity, right, from one government to the other. I remember clearly, right, during the first democratically elected, you know, in this Fourth Republic, Obasanjo's time, right, it wasn't the best of times, really, ever. Their times keep evolving. But you would see that there were some policy initiatives that were discontinued, right, by subsequent governments, right, that if they had continued, maybe we saw them as long, we saw them as 20-year plan. But what was 20 years in Obasanjo's time is the reality we're living today, right? If the Yar'Adua government has continued on those trajectory, if the Jonathan government had continued, but what you have is one government starts with, you know, we had the MDG, SDG, during Obasanjo times, we had NAPEP, you know, then another government comes, say 7-point agenda, from 7-point agenda, another one comes, says another thing, you know, a new government says renewed hope. When would we have a 50-year plan?
Isn't that as a result of interest groups, right? This discontinuity, isn't it as a matter of interest, entrenched interest?
Well, maybe, right?
Because
but
people might have funded a campaign and they need their money back.
Maybe, but I honestly think that if there is a way to sort of have a developmental master plan for Nigeria that will be legislated, that will become a law,
Correct.
that successive governments we have to follow because it's a law. Because if you make a master plan now, after this government leaves, the next government is not bound to follow it because it's an initiative. But if it's a law, for the next government to change it, it will be tough, right? We have to get to that point where we have that, you know, we're planning in decades, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? And we are following it judiciously. We are following it religiously. Of course, we are being creative, but we're following it well, right? So we lost a lot of the things we gained during the Obasanjo, you know, I'm sorry to mention, but previous tenures as successive tenures came and they were just, you know, overriding and overriding.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go to Momia, right? So looking at the economic hardships, the monetary and fiscal policies that the government is trying to impose, and the level of youth unemployment in Nigeria, these Sakawa boys, this Japa in Nigeria, what do you think are the security implications? What do you see to be the security implications of what is happening in terms of the economic hardships, the debt and everything? What are the security implications that you foresee is going to impact Nigeria in the long term?
I mean, to some extent, I mean, the security challenges have been, you know, have already been occurring in terms of, you know, some of the, you know, right, you know, we are not an economy that's given to data gathering in terms of, yeah, being able to have data that is, you know, key to making decisions, because it's very important. Data is important for decision making, and that's one core area I think that the government should focus on, and also partner with state governments as well to develop. Because I mean, you see like countries like abroad or overseas, they give you the stats on crime rates, and is also a key indicator, right? That is used to make decisions. Government uses it to formulate policies. So when you say, okay, crime rates has increased by this percent, there's always a measure, and then the crime is even broken down into the different types of crimes you get. I mean, you even tell you the states that have the highest level of crime rates, and those are used for, key inputs for decision making for government, because in a way, part of the role or the task of the government will be, okay, how do we reduce crime rate by this percent in the next 6 months? What are the things we need to do? Do we need to invest in more police? Do we need to increase employment? It's also a key input for economic decision making. How do we create more jobs for the unemployed, So those are some of the things that, is important in terms of looking at, what government can do. I mean, there are, also indicators, when there's rising inflation and the minimum wage or the income is not rising in line with
Standard of
inflation,
living.
that's the cost of standard of living, yes. I mean, the tendency for there to be social unrest and for there to be an increase in sort of insecurity is high, part of the factors that is driving some of the insecurity across the country is the level of poverty. If the level of poverty, the standard of living, I mean, my colleagues on the call made mention to the fact that I'm trying to remember that the middle class is being eroded, right? And Dr. Jami also said that even the rich cannot breathe, So the fact that the middle class is eroding and even the rich in the economy, I mean, we are seeing a lot of even those that can afford to live in the country relocating. That's not a good sign, right? Those that can afford to live in the country are actually the ones relocating. Is the upper class that are living in the country. It's the middle class. It's those that can, that can afford to pay for services are also leaving the country. So that's not a good sign. And what's left is, and then with a lot of even multinationals exiting because of the cost of living crisis. I mean, across the world, there's a cost of living crisis, of course. So those are factors that also will lead to insecurity. So it's important for the government to now sit down and look at it and say, okay, what are the ways that we can alleviate poverty levels in the country? How can we create more jobs? How can we, support business growth? Like support the expansion of business growth, create an enabling environment for businesses to survive and grow. How can we mitigate those things? And I know that one of we have the Fiscal Policy Reform Committee, and part of their work is not just to look at ways of streamlining the tax system and reducing taxes for the overall economy, but also looking at ways they can improve the ease of doing business within the economy so that more investment can come in. So these are issues that government have to look at, and it needs to be seen as a state of emergency.
Right.
Nigeria needs to be seen as being in a state of emergency, where across not just even, how do you even balance, how do you spread growth across the states? Because some states are burdened while other states, because people are moving, also there's not just migration of the country, there's migration even within the country, where people are moving from areas where there is low economic growth to areas where economic growth is higher, and those ones are suffering the strain of those, So there's a need for them not just to be growth, but government should also partner with states to say, okay, how can we drive growth in a way that even this idea of the tax system, how can we even, the tax system itself needs to be, how will I say, liberalized, reformed, yeah, so that states themselves can also focus on generating taxes. And the way to generate taxes, if you create business opportunities for businesses to flow into your, I mean, when you look at some countries, you find that there are certain states, like let's give America as an example. There are certain states that are known for certain economic growth. You know, they are the motor cities like Detroit, Michigan, where you have the car manufacturers. You have some states, it's food businesses. Some states is oil and gas. Some states. So how do you take advantage of the comparative advantage across that? In the north is very rich in agricultural resources. And, you know, because of the insecurity, a lot of the agricultural communities have been impacted. Agriculture used to be one of the major drivers of growth of the Nigerian economy, the agricultural sector. So what can we do to ensure that security is improved upon so that the farmers can go back to the farms and restore the growth of that sector? And from the farms, you can now build factories around the farms, like areas where, you know, there are specific agricultural commodities, build factories around those farms, improve on the road system so that the value chain, strengthen the value chain for exports, you know, in those areas. I mean, you see some state governors building cargo airports so that they can easily move some of these agricultural commodities from the farms straight to the manufacturing areas where they are needed. But you can also build factories up in those areas so that not only creating jobs for the farmers, you are creating jobs for the non-farmers, the youths. They can go into those manufacturing sector and become employees. You know, they work in those factories, and you create in some of these businesses create housing. You know, from there you can see that more businesses are created. When factories are created, employees move to those places, workers migrate there. You create housing to house the workers. You create hospitals to take, you know, schools are built. So that's how development happens.
Right.
So these are some, yeah.
All right, so let me follow up with Dr. Jafaru, right? So Momia was saying that Nigeria is more or less in a state of what? Emergency. She listed some of the security challenges, right? Poverty, right? Youth unemployment, people are leaving the country. Now, Nigeria has a national security strategy. Does the national security strategy looks at some of the internal security threats in terms of the poverty that we are talking about, in terms of the youth unemployment, that these are internal security challenges that must be addressed compared to a focus on terrorism, right? If you look at the national security strategy, it's more focused on terrorism, which has to do with the army, rather than focus on the police being able to have first-hand information about what is happening, data about people moving back and forth, right? Should we be what? Actually be giving the police more resources for them to be able to address internal security in Nigeria, instead of being so much focused on terrorism and counter-terrorism, that money is mostly being given to the army.
Prof, you see, insecurity has a very serious nexus with poverty and unemployment. You know, so of course, all these things, the issue, they are interrelated. So I think there's the need for a Marshall Plan, an integrated plan that will take care of all these things holistically. You know, instead of singling out one sector, you know, take care of it. If that, by singling out just one sector to take care of it before coming to another one, you know, you will not get the desired result. But I am aware that Nigerian governors at different fora, like the Northeast governors, they, you know, at the regional level, you know, I know that they are working towards this regional integration, and as a result of which they are working towards addressing these issues. And at the federal government level too, federal government is doing its own bit. Certainly, is not an issue that will be taken care of by only one government. You know, while the federal government is doing its own bit, the subnationals are also doing their own bit. And also, we as citizens, we know we also have our own roles to play.
Yeah, so yeah, but shouldn't the poverty and the youth employment, based on what Momia be saying, should be considered an emergency that needs to be addressed. Because if you see the destitution, right, the way people are dying and moving out of the country, right, basically it will come to a time that the government will not be able to generate enough revenue, right? Shouldn't the government see this youth unemployment, the poverty that you stated? She was also making the argument that if you look across the 50 states in the United States, for example, I live in the United States, places like New York probably is known for what? Financial services. If you go to probably like Florida, it has its own areas. If you go to Texas, the oil sector. Students we should be able to have this comparative advantage. In the north, for example, is good for agricultural services. Shouldn't the government be investing more money into the agricultural sector, right? Rather than seeing a huge migration of people moving from the north and coming to the south. When they come, they become disillusioned. And when they become disillusioned, they get themselves in all kinds of crimes in the southern sector. Shouldn't the government expedite action that this is an emergency that needs to be addressed?
Well, the gravity of the problem, is, going by, because of the gravity of the problem, that's why, but government is doing a lot. Government is doing a lot towards this. For example, now, I know that, okay, for example, now in Bank of Industry as it is today, now they are giving out money for startups. Do you understand? And also the same thing with Bank of Agriculture, and also Humanitarian Ministry are also doing their own bit. State governments are doing their own, but it is not something that will be done in, that it's not something that you see the result immediately. No, it will take time.
Okay, all right. So time is fast spent. Let's go to Akolawale. What is your closing remarks in terms of what we should be doing in terms of linking national security to the debt, right? Because the more debt we are accruing, the more we have to levy more taxes on people, and it will come to a time that people are going to rise, like what it did in Kenya, right? Like you said, the debt should be used efficiently. Right, we know situation in Nigeria where money that are meant for public projects and in people's pockets, people are signing checks into their own private bank accounts. These are unethical issues, right? Taking money away that is meant for public good, it is now ending up in people's private pockets. These are situations which are worrying in terms of trying to link debt with national security. What's your final word on that?
Well, thank you, Professor. I think the first thing we must realize is that security is not only physical, right? And the problem we have is that we think of security only physical, right? There is food security, right? There's social security. It is the dilapidation of these other aspects that actually heightens the physical security. So when there is unemployment and people are hungry, they become a ready militia that can be leveraged to create mayhem, right? So the investment we fail to make in having education security, social security, food security, we then would have to spend that money to prevent or to cure, right, the aftermath of it, which is jobless youth who become recruited into vices, right? So tying our budget to security for me means the money that, if you want to avoid spending much more on national security in the next 10 years, spend much more on education, right? Because the young person who is uneducated, who is unemployment, who is unfed, who does unemployable, I beg your pardon, who is unfed, who doesn't have a job now, in the next 20 years, can become the guy causing vices tomorrow. Right? And go and check it. The guys who are in Boko Haram 10, 15, 20 years ago didn't go to school. They were not fed and all. So for us, in my view, rather, national security, our budget should deal more with these areas. While, of course, we continue to deal with the physical security. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Momia. Your closing remarks, trying to look at the debt and the lack of the issues about poverty, youth unemployment, lack of education, illiteracy, right? People don't have jobs, market women don't even have startup money to do business. How do you relate that to security going forward?
Sorry, I didn't get your question again, Dr. Bertram. Can you comment?
I'm saying that what is your closing remarks in terms of some of the things that you enumerated, in terms of youth unemployment, in terms of poverty, right? What do you think government should be doing, right, to avoid this emergency that you are talking about?
I mean, like we said, they need to declare a state of emergency, right, in the country, because, you know, and acknowledge the fact that there's a crisis that needs solutions, right? And, you know, come to the drawing board to look at how do we resolve these issues. I mean, the reforms of the economy starts with the government, right? I know, and my colleagues have on the call have constantly talked about government spending, fiscal prudence, like where are the areas we need to be prudent in order to free up more revenues to spend in critical sectors that need it. You know, I know that the government has been trying to institute social safety nets, right, for those at the bottom of the pyramid, the poor, you know, to support them at this time. But in order to do that, you need revenues, you need funding to be able to do that. And with the increased debt burden, there's only very little limits they have to be able to sustain that. So there's a need for the government to first of all look inward. The messaging has to come from the government itself. You know, in a situation where you are asking people to kind of cut costs, you're asking people to tighten their belts,
Right. Yeah.
And people are seeing you and you're not tightening your own belts. You know, you're still going with a large delegation for certain global events that maybe don't require some of these people. You are buying new assets, you know, things that are not maybe, that do not add value, you get. So there's a need for government to show the country that they themselves are also willing to sacrifice the way that the populace is sacrificing, in a way that would help to mitigate some of the anger and the you know, the social insecurity in the economy. You know, if they eliminate a lot of wastages and plow that back into funding critical sectors that need the funding right now, I think that would also go a long way to help in terms of, and then, like I said, private sector-led growth. The private sector needs to drive the growth of the economy. And the only way they can do that is if you create an enabling environment for businesses to grow, eliminate multiple taxes, streamline tax payments, you know, provide a buffer to the business sector in these hard times that will enable them to be able to, you know, build back their businesses. You know, increase the minimum wage. Where would the money come from? It will have to come from, you know, eliminating those leakages and wastages, you know, within the government. So those are some of the ways that they can be able to, you know, and have a plan of how, okay, we're at this level. I mean, when you look at India and China and how much they've been able to reduce poverty, they had a plan. Maybe poverty was at a high percent. They were one of the poorest countries, like India, in terms of poverty rates. But they had a plan. And you could see the effect of that plan by how much poverty has reduced. The middle class has expanded in those countries. And then they're even overtaking some of the traditional European countries on the list of the top 10 largest economies in the world. They are moving up those lists. So the government has to have a plan of, okay, we are going to reduce poverty by 10% every year. And this is what we are going to do to achieve that, you get. And in order, so those plans need to be implementable as well. They have to have the political will. Political will is very important. Without it, government cannot do much. Without that political will, so the top has to be willing to make those sacrifices and implement those policies. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So since Omomia brought the issue about China, I just want to give you some data, right? Between 1979 up to now, China has been able to raise over 500 million people from poverty to the middle income class. That's a huge chunk of people. Now let's come back to you, Dr. Jafar. You have the last word, right? We know that Nigeria's crisis is a lot. And the government is doing what it can do, is doing its possible best. But the problem is that we have a situation where government starts a project, another government comes, it abandons it. And we know the level of corruption also in Nigeria. Shouldn't we have leaders who are very ethical, like you said, who are very ethical, who are thinking about the interest of the country, right? Like what we had in the United States, the baby boomers in the 1950s, they were able to build a country in the 1950s, and that is what we are seeing now. Shouldn't we have the politicians with a political will thinking about sacrificing for the nation instead of them thinking about their own parochial interest in terms of living lavish life like what we saw in Kenya, which upsets the Gen Z to revolt? We know the challenges in Nigeria are enormous, but there should be that political will for the political leader to do the necessary sacrifice, right? To be able to bring everybody on board. But you don't tell the people tighten up your belt and you are riding in expensive cars, flying around the world, going to what conference with few delegations. Shouldn't that be what we should be doing, like you said, trying to be a little bit more ethical?
You see, Prof, governance, our leadership selection process now is key. And if we do not change the leadership selection process, we'll certainly not get it right. You look at the 36 state governors in Nigeria, look at the president, his vice president, and all the 360 members of the National Assembly, look at them very well. If they apply for employment in your company, how many of them will you employ? So in the situation whereby the leadership election process is so monetized, it is now left for only people that have their own money. How much do you pay for a nomination form for state assembly? How much do you pay for nomination form into the House of Representatives? Governors, president, and the Senate. So if this thing is not, if leadership selection process is monetized, anybody that has a sponsor will now go and look for his own sponsor. And the people that are doing business, they don't mind sponsoring, their lackeys, their proteges in position. Now, how many of us are transparent in government? Now, the led, do they even have confidence? Let me tell you what happened. Even this end bad governance protest that you see in Nigeria is certainly because the poor, the led, have lost confidence in the leaders, in the leadership. Before these guys go up to the street, most of us, the political leaders, have talked to them. Even religious leaders have talked to them, but they do not budge because they don't have confidence in them. In the last 1 year, you have seen how things have gone really bad. So the challenges are enormous. The challenges are enormous. And of course, it starts with us. When we want change, it must begin with us. Now, for example, now we set a standard and say, okay, now this is the category of, this is a class of persons we want. This is a qualification of leaders we want. This is a qualification of people who want in position of authority. And see, give us 2 years, things will shape in. But so long as we always elect those that come with money, now people have collected, of course, a sachet of spaghetti. People have collected just a measure of rice and they voted someone, and see how we are all crying today.
They call it stomach infrastructure, right?
Sorry?
They said they call it stomach
infrastructure. Stomach infrastructure, like, yeah, like what you said. Stomach infrastructure. You know, so we must persevere. You know, we must persevere and we must stand firm and say we want the right thing to be done. And we must demand for good governance. If we do that one, certainly we'll get things done in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, don't forget that we say we in political science, what the way Nigeria goes is the way Africa goes, right? Nigeria is the embodiment of everything that happens in Africa, right? So if Nigeria is not able to put its acts together, it creates a whole problem for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, right? So if Nigeria is able to put its house in order, it becomes the hegemon, right? It becomes the hegemon who can speak, right? See what is happening in the with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, right? And Nigeria is caught up. But Nigeria in the past used to be the leader, trying to lead the way by telling us the direction that we need to go. But here we have a Nigeria which is more or less in a crisis. So we hope and pray that Nigeria will be able to get its act together to lead Africa or to lead sub-Saharan Africa. Instead of we now currently relying on South Africa and relying also on Senegal to show us the way, right? So on this note, we've got, you want to say something briefly?
No. I just want to say that I am confident that the sleeping giant of Africa has woken up. And certainly in a maximum of 5 years from today, we will get there. I am confident about that.
Thank you very much, right. So on this note, I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Jafaru Omomia and Akolawole for joining us today on the Sankofa African Affairs series. Like I said, next week, we'll be hosting the Director of Prosperity of the World Bank in Washington, D.C., where we are going to bring youth leaders across the African continent to engage him based on what is actually happening on the African continent in terms of debt and its impact on the citizens. So we'll be looking forward to having a good program next week. On this note, I say thank you to all of you and enjoy the rest of your weekend from New York. All right. So see you.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Jafaru.
Thank you so very much. Again, yeah. Omo.
Thank you very much, sir.
Omomia, all right, thank you so very much. It is really, really